So this session is about working with perpetrators, so not at all a controversial or complex session at all. Luckily we have some experts to guide us through. We have Michelle Perry here from No to Violence, we have Christine Craik from RMIT and Dr Laura Tarzia from the University of Melbourne. Can I ask, I'll start with you, Laura, just
Sure.
Going down the panel, can you just introduce, well, I've obviously introduced where you're working, but how do you come to the area of working with perpetrators?
So I should start off by saying I'm not a clinician. I don't have a clinical background. I guess my take on this issue is working in research around domestic and sexual violence, and part of the program of work that we've been doing at Melbourne Uni and through the Centre for Family Violence Prevention at the Women's has been looking at early intervention with men using violence and some, I guess, innovative ways that we could do that, including using technology.
So are you actually evaluating existing programs, or are you delivering programs, or neither?
Neither really. It's mostly around I suppose looking at that subset of men who are not currently engaged with services, so who might not be in a behaviour change program, who might not be interacting with police and those kind of things. But so partly looking at some opportunities through health systems to intervene early before violence escalates, and using technology. So I guess it's about the kind of preemptive work that needs to happen and developing this online early intervention tool and then evaluating it.
So they're identified perpetrators, but they're not linked in with a current behaviour change program or some kind of they're outside existing programs.
Yeah, so they may even not be at the point where they themselves would identify as a perpetrator. They might be in the really, really early stages of, I feel like there's something happening in my relationship that is not quite right. There's a lot of arguments, conflict, so forth. Potentially they may even be blaming their partner for that. And so it's just trying to find that engagement point that makes that thinking shift of, I need to actually get some help for this, and getting them to take that first step.
Okay, all right. And so Christine, what are you doing at RMIT around working with perpetrators?
Well, nothing really, no.
I'm just here for lunch.
That's why I thought it'd be a good day out. I'll sit up here. No, so I teach family violence in the social work programs at RMIT, but I'm doing my PhD. I'm actually at the very last bit of it. I'm really hoping I finish it before I retire. And one of the things that I found out, so I've interviewed different focus groups of women who used emergency departments while they were living with family violence. And one of the things that's come out of the research that I wasn't expecting was the ways in which emergency department staff and health professionals unconsciously collude with perpetrators and don't understand that emergency departments are a perpetrator's place of choice to bring his partner when he lets her come for medical assistance. So it's kind of like an offshoot of the research, and it's been really distressing, interesting but distressing to see the ways in which that happens. So these are men that haven't been identified as perpetrators, that aren't being identified as perpetrators, but very much are perpetrators, and understanding from the women and the conversations with them all the observable ways that health professionals could be looking out for signs that these guys are perpetrators. And in the experiences of the women, not one of the women that presented with their perpetrators to the emergency departments had that man identified as a perpetrator, nor did they have their family violence identified. Even in the 3 cases of the 40 that were physical abuse, the story he told and the things he said first was the narrative that was taken as accepted. And even in the cases where the police were the ones that brought the women in, he got to the police first, so that narrative was the accepted narrative, and then that was the narrative that carried on at the hospital. So there are a lot of things that we could be doing, which is sort of secondary, I suppose. Yeah.
And obviously one of the big issues that will come up today, and that comes up in any discussion about this, is the risk of collusion.
Yep.
And intentions not abating that risk. Michelle, so you're at No to Violence. So just for people who might not be familiar with NTV, can you give us a quick précis?
Yes, so firstly, thank you for putting me with the academics. You know, that's
No, look, we're on this side.
Okay. So No to Violence, for those who don't know, is a peak body for the sector that works with male perpetrators of family violence. We operate in Tasmania, Victoria and New South Wales, but we've been in Victoria for 25 years this year. So we've kind of grown up with the sector as well. Our work is focused on the peak work, supporting our members, which is primarily those that run men's behaviour change programs. But now we're getting more broader services to casework and so forth. We also deliver training, and I'm happy to say that one of our training team is delivering training at the Women's Hospital today on working safely with men who use family violence. And we also actually have a clinical service called Men's Referral Service, which is a 24/7 state-funded, Victoria state-funded telephone helpline for men.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm just going to, I was going to say the best thing. The thing I've decided to do is just go to the hardest issue first.
Oh, okay.
And that is, that I hear over and over and I've heard for a couple of decades. Can you work with perpetrators effectively?
You're looking at me?
I am. I'm going to start this way and give our academics some time to think. Is it worth it? Is the money worth it? Is the time worth it? Is the media attention worth it? Because we all know there are people who just go, this is a waste of time. They are who they are, and it doesn't change. So what do you think?
Surprisingly, I'm going to say yes. Not surprisingly at all, really. But I think it's a really good question, because there's still people that need convincing. And I think that's because, and I'm hearing all of this wonderful research come out, there hasn't been enough real evidence to say that it's an effective process and how it is effective. So what we at No to Violence are saying, and I think it's being taken up a lot more, particularly in Victoria, is that family violence is an issue for men. And unless we work with the men, it's going to continue. We know that a lot of our clients will get through the process of the program that he's in with one family only to go on to the next. So in a primary prevention, it absolutely is the way we raise our children, men, boys and girls, and the respectful relationship programs hopefully will make an impact on that.
I'll come back to the more sort of broader cultural change, but in terms of can you take a perpetrator and put him through a men's behaviour change program and he come out the end non-violent?
So the research so far suggests that, and there was one research in the UK Mirable project that demonstrated, and by the way, you can't do research by asking the men how much they've changed. So the research must ask the families what their experience is, and over time. So. And what's come out is that those men who are willing to consider the gendered issue are more likely to go on to change. It also depends on where that man is on the continuum. And I'm glad we've kind of flowed on from intersectionality, is that there's no one size that fits all for any person. What we want to do and what we need to do is get that model of change, our research model of change, and back it up in our services.
Are you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying yes, it can work if it's done properly and it's researched and evaluated, but
yes.
You do believe it can work?
Yes.
Okay, Christine.
Yes. I would have to say I think the jury is still out on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Mirabel project, as you say, in the UK is the only long-term study that we've done where they've gone and followed through men, 4 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years afterwards. And even that was very sort of shaky about the ones that came forward to participate in the project. and for the success rate. I've worked in the family violence field for about 30 years, and I've been the observer in a couple of men's behaviour change groups, and I've seen a couple of times that aha moment with men in the groups where suddenly they you can almost see the shock on their face where they stop and think about where they learnt to be men and how they learnt to be men and what that's done for them in their lives. But it was sort of very few and far between, to be honest. I think it's the only solution we've got at the moment is men behaviour change programs, and I think until we find something that works better, I think we're sort of stuck with that. But we haven't done any long-term evaluation in Australia, and we really need to, because Australia is a different culture than the UK anyway. You know, you talk about intersectionality within Australia. I find Australia the most kind of undercurrent sexist society of Western societies that I think I've ever sort of studied. So
it has to be local.
Yeah.
So Laura, what about? Do you want to weigh in, or has it been said?
I think most of it's been said. I agree with Christine. That's my understanding of the research as well. Is that in fact there's been very few proper evaluations of men's behaviour change or other ways to intervene with men, and my understanding of the evidence that is out there on behaviour change programs is it's quite mixed. I wouldn't say it's strong evidence that it works, which doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It's just that evaluations haven't kind of produced that consistent evidence to say, yes, we should definitely all be doing this. I think the other thing to say about behaviour change, and I don't mean to harp on about this, but it's also thinking about what works and for whom. So people who are in men's behaviour change programs usually are mandated to be there. They're not often there because they've kind of done that kind of critical self-reflection and thought, I need to go. They've been told, you have to go. And so that is a particular group of men who potentially might be quite resistant to changing. And so I don't know how that potentially affects the outcomes of those programs, if it means that the people in them are always going to be the ones less likely to, change their behaviour. Last year, my team and I did a systematic review looking at the evidence for any interventions in health settings. So with the rationale that with those interventions, you're potentially engaging a group of men who are earlier in the kind of trajectory of using violence.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say interventions in the health setting, do you mean someone's identified as a perpetrator and you're working with them, or you invite them to participate in a program?
There were a whole lot of interventions, different ones. So there were kind of things like people had been identified by the research team as using violence, or they had disclosed that they were using violence. Some of them were in treatment already for alcohol and substance issues. There was one in various types of clinics. Some of them were people from the community who were then attending a health setting for some kind of CBT type treatment. So a whole range of things that we found in this review. But when we put them all together and looked at the evidence, it was really, really poor. There were so few interventions. The studies were done in kind of dodgy ways in some cases.
So it's not that the outcomes were poor, you couldn't trust the studies?
The studies were poor,
okay.
Methodologically poor. So they were very small studies, or, there were things that weren't reported that meant we can't really rely on the findings. So overall,
we don't know enough.
We don't know enough is the bottom line. We really don't know enough. We don't know enough about behaviour change programs, and we certainly don't know enough about things that can happen before someone gets to that point.
Is there evidence, and I'll ask you this again, Laura, is there evidence to, as distinct from men's behaviour change, so, I'm a whatever age male and I'm a violent perpetrator and I'm forced to go, as distinct from an early intervention program where you're displaying, say, controlling behaviour or sexist attitudes, is there evidence to suggest that there's more likely to be change in that group? Or do we not know that?
I don't think we know for sure, but I think there's some evidence to suggest that the men who are most likely to change are the ones who, I think you mentioned that, who have come to that realisation on their own and who kind of understand that the way their behaviour is affecting others and, gendered behaviour and that kind of stuff.
So they're less resistant to the gender undermining the rigid gender stuff.
Yeah, I think. But again, there's still not a lot of evidence out there overall in this whole area. There's an overall real lack of evidence to inform practice.
And in terms of especially keeping that in mind, and particularly given that we're talking to health professionals, what are the risks of collusion? So can we start with you, Michelle? I mean, I know from hearing people from NTV talk before, one of the things you look out for is literally you've got a bunch of perpetrators together. Do they chat in the car park and go, this is a load of bullshit, you know, I'm allowed to be the man of the house? What are the ways that we have to prevent collusion? What does collusion mean as well?
So the definition of collusion is to reinforce that other person's opinion in a subtle way, or an obvious way in some cases. We know that as a society we've colluded with the idea that it's okay to use violence against women for as long as, you know, forever. And so we all come as a product of that society. So we collude in ways that we're not even aware of often. So to say you should never collude, I think gives a task that makes you quite hyper vigilant. So what we're saying at No to Violence is you can come back from a colluding moment, but just be aware that when a man's used, and I'm being very generalised here, family violence, he uses a number of tactics to avoid responsibility, such as blaming, minimising, so forth.
He's likely to be a skilled manipulator.
And very skilled at doing that. So, and I've, you know, even though I've worked for years with these clients, it's still very easy, and particularly if you're a compassionate person and you're in that caring, you're there to care for your patient, not to get wound into his story. What we don't expect you to do, though, is to openly be coercive with him, because may even be even more dangerous for the family. That if you call him out and say, "Oh, you're blaming her, but you've done this, this, and this," and it's not dealt with in that sort of specialised way, he can actually become quite impacted by that, quite furious with that. He's been exposed, he'll experience that shame, and invariably he can take it out on his family as well.
So you don't want to, and again I'm just trying to put it in lay terms, you don't want to charge in on your white horse and call him out and then just leave and leave him with the potential victim.
I often say, and this is a controversial topic, maybe I shouldn't get it filmed here, but if I need to collude with a man to increase a family's safety, I'll do it. If that's going to be the best thing for that family.
You mean to calm
him
down, for example?
Yes, yeah. However, we need to be careful, and this is what No to Violence is working with our 10-year industry plan to increase the skills of the workforce, is so we can all use the same language. We can all listen out for the narratives that these men bring to avoid responsibility.
Well, and that are supported in the media and families and
everywhere.
So on. So Christine, in terms of, it's you doing PhD in the ED?
Yeah,
No, yes.
ED screening.
So
processes,
in the ED screenings, like let's say I'm a man and I bring a woman into the emergency department, you said this is where I want to be. What do you mean by that?
Oh, well, perpetrators and the women have all talked about this in the research. an emergency department at between 11:30 and 2 o'clock, 11:30 at night, 2 o'clock in the morning on the weekend is definitely a perpetrator's place of choice. So I had stories after stories of women who were injured, who had to go for medical help, and they weren't allowed to go until those times because the perpetrators know there's going to be skeleton staff. They know that the staff are going to be fairly busy, the ones that are there. They shop around at emergency departments, so they might go to Sunshine Emergency Department one weekend, 2 months later they're at the Royal Women's, 6 weeks after that at the Royal Melbourne. There's no opportunity at all for any story to be built up around that woman and what's going on for that woman. So very much perpetrators' places of choice. The delayed medical attention, again, I had information from women where they'd gone, be 4 days before they were able to get to some medical help. They'd go and get the medical help with their partner, who would walk in and say, I've been so anxious, I've been beside myself. She has a thing about doctors and nurses and being here. You don't know what it took me to get her here. Immediately that narrative's put on her, and they're all, aren't you a silly girl? Aren't you an idiot? You've delayed. Look what's happened because you haven't been here, instead of sort of being a bit critical about what's going on. And I think we all have those internalised myths about the caring, anxious, lovely man being believed over a hysterical, shocked woman. That's what we do. And it's being able to look at who's walking in the door with a bit of a perpetrator lens, doing that training so you can identify perpetrators, because I think that's what's happening. We're not identifying the perpetrators in those situations, so we just sort of go on to support their narratives, if you like. And some of the things that they'll say about their partners, she's crazy, she's mental, they dehumanise her or pathologise her. It's a dead giveaway when that's starting to happen. But sometimes we just think, he's a bit stressed, or, you believe his narrative on it rather than those red lights going on in your head. And you know that there's something not quite right here, to try and get her on her own and have a bit of a chat with her.
And Laura, one of the things, I think we're getting better at it, but we do notice still over and over and over again the minimising that Michelle talked about, in the media and elsewhere, but also the false explanations, if I can put it that way. So he, the depression caused this, or he was drinking, or I constantly think to myself, I've got depression and I don't hit anybody. I drink, but that kind of common sense doesn't seem to come into it. How do you, in the online stuff that you're doing, are you actively looking out to counter those narratives?
Yeah, actually that was something, so we're in the process now with this online tool that we're developing, which we're calling Better Man for the moment. But it was something that we've been working closely with NTV actually to develop this, and doing a lot of workshopping with an advisory group and talking to men as well. And certainly the researchers and the advisory group and our partners at NTV, was something that we talked about, was how do we kind of make this thing interactive for men to use, but at the same time not allow opportunities for them to kind of use it as an opportunity to say bad things about the partner or to minimise their own use of violence. And so we talked about it kind of in a practical way, like, do we have free text, things that they can input stuff, or do we just have closed choice questions where there's actually no possibility for them to, go off on a kind of rant about, but my partner this, my partner that. It is tricky to do with technology because you don't have that kind of face-to-face ability to tailor your response.
One of the I don't know why it just popped into my head, but I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this. There's a particular men's rights activist group that shouldn't be allowed to call itself that, but that literally trawls the internet for depression Facebook pages, where men go to Facebook for help for depression and inject these ideas about, this is actually your mother's fault, or it's, whatever. So sexist sort of ideas that deliberately trawl for vulnerable men. Michelle, how can we, and then I'll get questions from the floor, how can we strike a balance between offering empathy, because there are perpetrators in pain and their stories are real. How can we strike a balance between empathy and understanding and not colluding and excusing?
So historically, it's been an either or. You're either colluding or you're making him responsible, and I'm using that gesture deliberately. What we say is that you can actually be what we call collaborative. So you're there to administer a service to either him or the family member. I would, I highly recommend that. Just make it a normal part of the procedure that she gets some time alone with you. Not for any other it's a medical thing. I have to take you away for this, or I need to see you alone for whatever.
And that you do that with every single patient,
whether or not you have any concerns or not. And I know that's just another thing to do, but that would be a great way to screen without alerting him, because he's really hypervigilant about
who she's talking to.
Yeah. So I would say definitely be collaborative with that man. He's not going to listen to anything that you say unless it's something that's going to benefit him, and that's where we have to come to our practice with men on a specialist level is how do we pitch it so that he's not going to say, well, I don't want to hear from you,
Or indeed that she won't ever be allowed to come to the emergency department again.
Yes, yeah. And so, again, it's just about listening to that narrative and not buying into it. I think that's adequate, and then making sure that she's been given an opportunity to disclose to you.
So in a sense, Christine, do you think it's reasonable, for example, to try and have some sort of policy that makes sense to say to a perpetrator, we need to take her away for this X amount of time and then we'll come back? I mean, I'm obviously, in a very basic way. We do this for everyone that comes in, and it's a privacy issue. Yeah. Is that a reasonable thing?
I think it needs to be a routine thing that just happens all the time. We
especially
always see a
Saturday
patient,
nights, by the sounds of it.
2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But we know family violence happens on after hours, weekends, and public holidays, and that's when emergency departments come. Well, that's when it's crazy in emergency departments. We all know that, those of us that have worked in them. So I think that's definitely it. We always see somebody, for the first 5-10 minutes on their own when they come into the emergency department. It's just got to be. And I've had women who've said to me that even with that they wouldn't have said anything because they know he's hypervigilant, as you say. He's going to be reading the health professionals' body language and face like a book, reading her face like a book. He has to be absolutely sure she has not said anything. So for some women, they won't say anything. But even if you're the health professional that can say, we do this with everyone, we just need to know if you're feeling safe at home or if there's anyone that's making you feel afraid or uncomfortable, in your life or your relationship or whatever the questions are. And, even if she doesn't have it in her to say anything at that point in time because it's not safe, you've had the conversation, you've validated that it's not okay, she knows it's a safe place to come if she comes here the next time and needs to ask, you've laid the seed, it's not a missed opportunity. So
I remember, and I don't know if any of you will remember, because I'm struggling to remember where it was, but there was definitely one hospital that was during their antenatal screening, as a deliberate strategy to be able to screen for family violence, had consultations with women only. And the men were told there was a physical privacy issue, and these were the discussions were taking place. Yeah. Okay, we've got time for some questions. Go for it, Kathy.
With the release of Brain Injury Australia's report earlier this year showing the prevalence of acquired brain injury for both perpetrators and victims of family violence and their children, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on men's behavioural change for individuals who have cognitive impairment issues.
Okay, so can everyone hear? Can everyone hear, Kathy? And can I ask you to just put your phones on silent? That would be great. So in terms of acquired brain injuries for both perpetrators and victim survivors, do they need different training?
Well, I'm very interested in that as well. So we were involved in that research, and it was just amazing that we hadn't actually put the two together before. In regard to perpetrators with acquired brain injury, I mean, we know that the large proportion of prison population have an acquired brain injury. So our thinking at the moment is there isn't any modified group for cognitive impairment, and at this stage we're considering either having something specific for that, or having a practice guide for when you do have men in your group that fit that.
Can I just ask, in case everyone's in the same position as me, as not having read the report, is the report suggesting that acquired brain injury is a contributing factor, or that the training needs to be different? Like, is the idea that with having an ABI would make you more likely to be violent, or saying if you do have someone with an ABI you need to deal with them differently? If you have someone with an ABI, you need to deal with them differently. That's not a causal or a...
No,
yeah, okay.
no. And because of the impulsivity, and it's also to do with, you know, some of the higher level topics that we might talk about in men's group, and self-reflective and you know, concept thinking. And I've had many a client in group that, for whatever reason, that type of activity, that type of discussion only makes them feel more inadequate and uncomfortable, and they're least likely to come back if they have a choice. So we're looking at that.
Can I ask your question on this again? If we're going to get into it. Can you say, or does one say, is it productive to say, I'll say this again from a talk-back point of view, your feelings are your feelings, but they're wrong? And I don't mean that without compassion, but I mean, you know, that, well, I feel like I'm more oppressed than you are, or I feel like you've got more rights than I do. And you go, well, but objectively you just don't.
Yeah, I don't think it works, whether it's right or wrong.
Right.
I don't think it actually works saying that to anyone.
You know, I feel like she made me do it.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Well, you're
but
wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Christine?
Can I say, I read an article the other day, and I can't remember where I read it, so it's not very helpful for anyone here, but it talked about how, and it was to do with perpetrators, or to do with people that had anger issues or unregulated emotions, that's how it was put, that sometimes the first comment or the first thought, that's your first comment or your thought. And if somebody says, well, you know, I'm more oppressed than she is, you've got a perpetrator saying that, that's the first thought. And then you try and delve underneath that. You know, you'd want to have a conversation around that. Why is it that you think that? What makes you think that? You know,
so keep asking questions.
Yeah, keep asking. The first one's just the reaction, and then we have a look underneath that. So I like that. I've been practicing on my own children.
Yes. But why? But why?
That's
but
exactly
why?
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go for it. Yep, just behind you there.
Hi, Jackie Kelly. I'm just wondering where all the men are in this whole problem with men, and why aren't the men dealing with men? You know, why is it always the women that are doing all the behavioural men's change groups, etc.? I did a master's in and evaluated men's behavioural change programs across the world, and I know from that research that it really hasn't made a difference. So I think that we really need to change and start getting men on board with doing this work. Yeah.
So in No to Violence, there are men involved. Do you know your proportion?
We have men, yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, our minimum standards are that for every men's behaviour change, you must have a male and a female facilitator to facilitate the group. So that's easier said than done. You're right, we have overwhelmingly more female staff or workforce than males, but we do have, we are trying to encourage more men into the sector. We have many men, and in fact No to Violence was a men's only organisation up until a few years ago. And I think we've enhanced, improved the service, but it started off as this is men for men. There's absolutely positives to that.
Christine, do you think, and I'm only saying this because I've heard it elsewhere, do you think the reason there aren't men involved in this is because they don't actually think men will change?
No, I don't think that. I just don't think at times they think it's a man's problem. I love the no to violence philosophy, and I often get a lot of men from the Men's Referral Service or no to violence come and talk to my students on respectful and responsible work with perpetrators. So I know quite a few of them in the field, and they're men that work with violence, and they really understand that it's a man's problem and it has to be done respectfully alongside women's services and alongside the stories of survivors, which I absolutely love about their philosophy. I don't like men moving into the space that bang their drum about how great they are that they're in this space. And I think we all know who I'm talking about here. You know, they call themselves champions and wear ribbons and run around, and that just drives me insane, because the women that have been working so long in this field forever, they're the ones doing the work, but they're not, not out there glorifying it. So, yeah, I think it just has to be done in the right way. But you're right, it's a man's problem.
Can I play devil's advocate to that?
Yep.
And I am deliberately doing it as devil's advocate. If men are yes, with, the ribbons and the you have to be a champion and the words and the so on, isn't a win a win? Isn't men coming into the space, if it's done respectfully and really wanting to engage in change? Yes, women have done the bulk of the work and it's bloody annoying, but does a good idea care where it came from?
If it's done respectfully, yes, I absolutely agree with you. But if it's suddenly you have to turn around and go, well, you guys are really good men, get out. Enough. I just think that's how you're supposed to be.
I'm so on the fence with that one. Yeah, go for it.
Given that we know that there's spikes in domestic violence at the point where there's pregnancy or a first birth, do you know of any types of programs that have been introduced as more of an early intervention or preventative strategy for men at that point? Is there any kind of...
So when pregnancy's, I was going to say diagnosed. That's
yeah. Has there been any work done in that kind of early stages?
So early on, before birth, yeah. Do we know? Are there any early intervention? I think there are, aren't there?
Well, there's screening in a lot of antenatal programs and things like that.
Baby makes three, yeah. But that's not like universal, is it? No. Yeah. So there are interventions, but not across the board, I think is the short answer to that. Yeah, hang on. Yep.
I just want to go back to your comment before about isn't a win a win, and the men sort of spruiking their wares. I think that actually goes to the heart of the problem of privilege and male privilege, and what they do is special, and what everyone else who's been working in the field for ages does is just normal and not special. So I think that's the heart of the problem, really.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also just wonder, when you sometimes see when we go, why aren't there more men in this room, for example, or why aren't there more men in the media talking about it, or why aren't there more... Sometimes I worry that when they do get in the media, for example, and talk about it, we go, you didn't use the right word, or you called yourself a champion, or rather than going, it's great we're talking about gender equity, I'm really glad that we're talking about being anti-violent. Does it give me the shits that they take the credit for, decades of work? Yes. But I'm torn. I don't know. I can't be the only one who's torn, or am I?
I remember thinking at a conference, this very topic came up, and there was a man at the front delivering some practice knowledge, and then the criticism came up saying, so now we're going to have men telling us how to do this thing. And I was sitting next to a colleague, a male colleague, and I'm not going to say what I actually did say, but I said, you guys are, in trouble, no matter what you do.
You're fired, right?
Yeah. And so there can be a bit of that. But I also know, absolutely agree, that even our program, even our sector, is still influenced by the patriarchal society that we live in. And we do have men that are they're either on a mission to save all womankind, or they're there to redeem themselves for their action.
And it's like another version of Dad doing the dishes on Friday night wanting a standing ovation. Like, I totally get that.
Yeah.
I totally get that.
If we talked about trauma-informed even 5 years ago, you know, I could be booed off the stage. I still could be, but still. I think it's absolutely imperative that we have a trauma-informed lens, and that's what, again, we're working. We haven't articulated our model of intervention. I think that's the problem. And we need to include, we have had the feminist underpinnings for many years, and we need to keep those solidly, but we have to build, we have to become smarter. And that's including model of change, trauma-informed, having a program logic to everything.
Does everyone know what Michelle's talking about when she says trauma-informed? Everyone, okay. You better not do this if you don't.
Sorry
I'm
if
just
I'm
going to assume.
jargony.
Okay, everyone
Yes.
knows. All right.
Yeah.
You've got a question there? Nice and quick.
Very quick. Occupational violence for healthcare workers is a major risk in hospitals. You talked before about the 11 till 2 time when a male might come in with his partner. How do we strike a balance between that side conversation, between checking in on the welfare of a female in a relationship and
your risk,
the risk for healthcare workers?
Yeah.
And and what that might look like
So,
in
Christine,
an ED.
you've been in emergency departments, haven't you?
Yeah, I think. Look, it's absolutely it's a reality, that risk, and sometimes, I mean, if you can separate the woman from the man, just I'm generalising, but if you can separate the two and have a conversation with the woman and then get back there, and as I said, she may disclose, she may not, but give her the information anyway, that's fine. But I think if you're respectful in your challenges in the language, I think you're going to be okay. Unless, I mean, if someone comes in and they're off their face on some kind of substance or off their face on ice or whatever, you're going to be, that's not the time.
Already.
You're at risk already, so you wouldn't be doing that then anyway. But I mean, I don't think there's anyone here works in a hospital that hasn't been screamed at by a patient or by a patient's support person at one time or another. Everyone's nodding good because I'm thinking, oh my God, that's just me. It's definitely an issue.
Do you know, it's interesting, I remember, and you would have all been, or you two would have certainly, when the changes came in about, bloodborne viruses and so on, I remember seeing a speaker say, basically, every time you treat someone, whether it's your uncle, whether it's the next door neighbour or one of your patients, you put gloves on so that if your uncle does have Hep C or whatever it is, he doesn't have to tell you. And I know this is a long bow, but it occurs to me, same thing. Every time someone comes into ED, we always separate. We always take you away. This is just common practice. It's not weird.
Yep.
Would that be helpful?
Yep.
That doesn't already happen?
No. Absolutely not.
Very, 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 very quickly.
I was just going to ask if there's any research, because I work with if there's any research to back that up, like I work with nurses who experience that in a clinic setting, that they work with doctors who are very data driven and need the evidence and that to justify why they're doing things. So instead of, they sort of don't listen to the nurses when they say you should separate the two people.
They don't listen to the nurses. That's not part of the problem at all.
That's right.
But, is there any evidence or literature that we can give to, because they would if they had evidence there in front of them.
It sounds like we need more evidence on everything.
New Zealand.
In New Zealand.
New Zealand?
New Zealand are doing everything right.
No, they've got a female prime minister.
That's all right. Who wouldn't take a pay rise?
Yeah, who had a baby on the job.
Had a baby on the job.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
And she's not married, I know. The world's ending. Look, I don't want to cut into your afternoon tea time. I know we could sit here all day on this one topic, but thank you for giving us at least an entry point into it. Can you please join me in thanking Michelle, Christine and Laura?